It's Game Boy World, and this is Gargoyle's Quest. It may seem hard to believe, but despite being an NES mainstay, Capcom didn't publish its first game for Game Boy until a full year after the system's debut. By comparison, Konami showed up within about 4 months with MOTOCROSS MANIACS, and Who the Heck Are They Nobodies like Meldak had multiple Game Boy releases out in Japan by the time Capcom showed up for the party. As it turns out, this was not because Capcom didn't care or have any interest in Game Boy. Rather, the long delay of their arrival in the handheld space happened because Capcom of the 80s and 90s held itself to exquisitely high standards. Gargoyle's Quest, which debuted late in April 1990 in Japan, was a cut above the usual Game Boy sludge. If the lowest basis level of content for the system to date has been half-hearted pachinko and puzzle games, atop which a layer of decent to good puzzlers and action games is set, Gargoyle's Quest occupies the rarefied space a notch above those. It wasn't a flawless creation, but it possessed a level of quality and ambition that to date we've only really seen in a handful of titles. Super Mario Land, Tetris, Final Fantasy Legend. You could arguably put Revenge of the Gator, Nemesis, and maybe Mercenary Force up there too. Aside from Tetris though, you can easily make a solid case for Gargoyle's Quest trumping them all. By far the meatiest and most substantial Game Boy action title to this point, Gargoyle's Quest more or less qualifies as the platform's first Metroidvania-style game. While the platforming sequences are broken up with a world map, similar to Zelda 2 or Clash of Demonhead on NES, the game has an exploratory, RPG-like feel to it. In practice, Gargoyle's Quest isn't really all that open-ended. The path to the ending is fairly straightforward, and the tiny world within this tiny cartridge offers very little to do besides journey to the final boss. Compared to the enormous map of the Final Fantasy Legend, for example, it feels utterly miniature, filling maybe the equivalent space of one of Final Fantasy Legend's multiple world maps. Despite the fact that Gargoyle hero Firebrand can wander into random encounters on the world map though, this is no RPG. Rather, it's a hard-as-hell platformer wearing an RPG skin, curiously obfuscating the fact that it requires strong twitch reflexes and pixel-perfect platforming chops. And no wonder considering its lineage. Though it's hard to tell from the American box art, Gargoyle's Quest in fact belongs to the Ghosts N Goblins franchise, a series whose renown comes largely from its resolute determination to destroy all who dare play it. That Capcom would go back to the Ghosts N Goblins well for its Game Boy debut shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Back in 1990, the series was arguably the company's primary breadwinner. At that point, it had even seen more sequels and spin-offs than Mega Man, whose third chapter would be arriving in Japan less than half a year following the debut of Gargoyle's Quest. Ghosts N Goblins had been Capcom's big breakout hit, building on the success of the addictive and iconoclastic shooter 1942. Arriving in Japanese arcades less than a week after the Famicom debut of Super Mario Bros., Ghosts N Goblins proved nearly as influential to the run-and-jump action genre as Nintendo's seminal work had. The particulars of that game are best left for a more in-depth Good Intentions episode, but the long and short of it is that where Super Mario made its mark by offering unprecedented player control and responsiveness within a consistent physics framework, Ghosts N Goblins practically shackled players with stiff, unforgiving controls and a brutal difficulty level. Super Mario Bros. Turned the side-scrolling platform design of Namco's Pac-Land into a joyful playground. Ghosts N Goblins transformed it into a merciless hellscape gauntlet. Ghosts N Goblins designer Tokuro Fujiwara put lots of hateful little details into the game to ensure it would burn itself painfully into players' memories, but none stood out quite so much as the infamous Red Arremer. While not technically a boss, this flying demon may as well have been. It took multiple hits to destroy, attacked ferociously, and commanded far greater mobility than poor protagonist Arthur. See, the thing that made Ghosts N Goblins so harrowing was that Arthur moved slowly and clumsily, with a rather pitiful jump that also represented a commitment. Once he took to the air, players couldn't alter his trajectory, so you had to see each jump through to the landing. Given the propensity of enemies to spawn suddenly or attack from the edge of the screen with swift projectiles, Arthur couldn't afford to leap with impunity, not even to attack airborne enemies. This made the Red Arremer an incredibly deadly threat. The demon made its first appearance toward the middle of the first stage, sitting patiently on the ground as if in meditation. Once Arthur approached, it would take flight, hovering just high enough to tempt players into jumping up to attempt to shoot it. But more often than not, this would prove to be a trap. The Red Arremer would swiftly descend in an arc to smash into Arthur. The demon's appearance became a race to see whether you could whittle down its health before it could dash into Arthur, and many sessions of the game ended right then and there. In terms of game design, the Red Arremer existed because of the realities of arcade gaming. To maintain profits, arcade vendors needed to ensure most players would need to insert a coin every 2 to 3 minutes. The Red Arremer showed up about a minute into the game, and a credit bought players 3 lives. So, 3 encounters with this wicked foe all but guaranteed Ghosts N Goblins would maintain a proper coin drop rate. Really, the Red Arremer belongs to the same class of foes as Joust's Pterodactyl, Mario Bros. Fireball, or Berserk's Evil Otto, an overwhelmingly dangerous enemy whose presence was specifically designed to prevent a play session from dragging on too long. But Ghosts N Goblins was a different kind of game than those other titles, offering an expansive scrolling world to explore rather than single-screen arenas to dominate. As such, its ever-shifting scenery provoked players to want to explore it, to see what lay beyond the next area. By the time the Red Arremer appeared in Ghosts N Goblins, players had already passed through a cemetery filled with varied terrain and found themselves on a cusp of a new environment. The speedy demon represented a deadly obstacle, but one players felt motivated to challenge thanks to the appealing visuals and music of the surrounding game. Clever players would even try to sneak past that first encounter to see the world beyond the Red Arremer's taunts, only to discover the diabolical creature would pursue them all the way to the end of the stage. Thanks to the Red Arremer's tricky movements and role as a universal speed bump, he quickly became an iconic and memorable part of Ghosts N Goblins lore. When the game's sequel, Ghouls and Ghosts, arrived in 1988, the Red Arremer didn't simply put in another appearance, he arrived with an upgrade, the armor-clad King Arremer. The Arremer race would receive even more variants and upgrades with 1991's Super Ghouls and Ghosts for Super NES. But first, the Unholy Terror would see its most surprising upgrade of all, a turn as the hero. Yes, even though he appears in the American box art as a goofy green gargoyle, and the monochrome Game Boy visuals depict him without any color at all, the protagonist of Gargoyle's Quest is in fact one of the dreadful Red Arremers. It's a pretty bold choice for a spin-off, casting players in the role of their most hateful nemesis and hoping they'd be willing to side against the good guys, but it works here. For starters, Gargoyle's Quest doesn't actually pit Firebrand against Arthur. You're not expected to destroy the hero of the series or anything. Instead, Firebrand finds himself as the sole resistance fighter in the Demon Realm when an army of destroyers invades his home world. The game begins with Firebrand returning to the Demon Realm through a portal and quickly establishes the stakes of the story and the mechanics of the action. Firebrand has an entirely different set of skills than Arthur did, including the ability to hover briefly in the air and cling to walls. Yet Gargoyle's Quest makes clear the fact that it has no intention of being any more lenient on its anti-hero than the original game Ghosts N Goblins was to its noble knight. Much as with Arthur, Firebrand's adventure is largely defined by the character's limitations. His movements are slow and methodical, his skills limited in power. Firebrand's projectiles inflict poor damage and don't even manage to cover the width of the Game Boy's diminutive screen. And while he can technically fly, in practice this amounts to hovering or dropping. And at the adventure's outset, he's only able to maintain hang time for a few seconds. Where Gargoyle's Quest sets itself apart from the series that inspired it, however, is with Firebrand's potential for growth. Where Arthur's potential began and ended with the random weapons he picked up along the way, Firebrand evolves permanently, gearing up with better equipment and mystical enhancements. This is no RPG, but as action games go, it definitely shows considerable RPG influence. Think The Legend of Zelda, as you gain new powers while you progress through the story, which not only improve your combat capabilities, but also allow you to advance to the next phase of the adventure. While the game seems entirely too brief and linear to work as a true and proper Metroidvania, it definitely flirts with that format. The idea of new combat capabilities doubling as tools for greater exploratory range in particular comes straight from Metroid, and it works beautifully, even within this tiny, bite-sized adventure. Gargoyle's Quest features 2 modes of play, side-scrolling platform action derived from Ghosts N Goblins, and top-down RPG like navigation in the Dragon Quest vein. The Dragon Quest connections run even deeper than that. For example, the final boss offers you the chance to join his side, with agreement leading to Firebrand's doom. The specter of Zelda 2 also hangs heavily over this quest, as random encounters that waylay Firebrand as he marches through the overworld explode not into turn-based encounters, but rather into self-contained side-scrolling battle sequences. The random encounter scenarios you have to fight through are basically micro-versions of the action dungeons that serve as the meat of the adventure. You'll face off against a handful of enemies in these spaces, and victory nets you a handful of vials, the game's currency. It's all very ambitious, though it can come off as somewhat half-formed. Gargoyle's Quest features all the hallmarks of a grand action RPG, but it feels like you barely scratched the surface on any of them before the game ends. For example, the in-game economy exists in service of a single material good, the fancy-sounding talismans of the Cyclone, which amount to 1-ups. Similarly, Firebrand's upgrade path doesn't really have any space to breathe. With only about half a dozen proper areas to battle through, your power-ups arrive in rapid succession, and there's really no time to appreciate the final upgrades, since you only receive them once you're locked into the approach for the relatively straightforward final palace. As was often the case for brief 8-bit action RPGs, Gargoyle's Quest compensates for its paucity of content with a brutally high difficulty level. The platforming challenges here differ in nature from those of Ghosts N Goblins, but they're nevertheless equally cruel. To counterbalance Firebrand's impressive mobility options, Capcom's design team, led by Ghosts N Goblins designer Tokuro Fujiwara himself, focused on building a world that would challenge those capabilities with cramped spaces and deadly environmental hazards. The difficulty in Ghosts N Goblins mostly stemmed from the placement, frequency, and unpredictability of enemies, and certainly Gargoyle's Quest offers its share of devious monsters to contend with. For the most part, however, the true danger in this world comes from its dense walls of spikes and deadly pitfalls. To succeed in Firebrand's quest, players need to master a handful of essential, unique techniques, the most important being the hover. While the ability to glide in the air for short bursts has obvious value in allowing players to extend the length of jumps, and indeed, the barrier to the back half of the game world can only be cleared by collecting a power-up that strengthens Firebrand's wings, you'll quickly discover the potential and importance of using hovering in combination with other skills. Late in the game, Firebrand acquires a power called the Claw, which, despite its name, fires a blob of goo that temporarily covers over spiked walls to provide a safe surface for the demon to grasp. Since you can't actually fly upward, only jump, your ascent through the game's vertical levels hinges on climbing from one wall to another. The Claw allows you to turn hazardous walls into climbable surfaces, though the safe spots vanish after about 5 seconds. This turns vertical sections into challenging exercises in managing time, space, and enemies, probably the meatiest and most unique of Gargoyle's Quest mechanics, but sadly, it ends far too quickly. The game has a cruel tendency to force you to maneuver beneath low, spike-lined ceilings. One of the trickiest aspects of the game comes from the way you detach from walls by jumping. This means that if you grab onto a surface directly below a hazard, there's no real way to avoid taking damage once you let go. Gargoyle's Quest demands mastery of its jump physics. Firebrand faces a number of devastatingly powerful foes too, sometimes frustratingly so. While there is a certain satisfaction to be derived from seeing the vexing nemesis from Ghosts N Goblins put in his place, the relative power level of the Destroyer army versus the denizens of the Demon Realm speaks to the deadliness of the threat featured in this adventure. Some of the demons here are more than a match for the mighty Red Arremer. Bosses fill the screen and tend to feel like they were borrowed from the Dr. Wily stages of future Mega Man games. That's especially true of the Tower Boss, which consists of 4 wall-mounted targets that aren't at all shy about firing back at Firebrand. The last couple of main enemies, Rushafel and Brieger, sit passively in the background and fire energy bolts at Firebrand, exposing their weak points only briefly. The final boss encounters do a great job of tying Gargoyle's Quest back to Ghosts N Goblins, while simultaneously helping to define this game's character. The Rushafel battle closely resembles the one at the end of Ghouls and Ghosts, but thanks to the difference between Firebrand and Arthur's combat skills, they play out quite differently. As Firebrand progresses through the realm, he constantly encounters new foes that pose different kinds of threats. Some appear in dungeons, while others will debut quite by surprise in random encounters. In the second half of the adventure, you'll even encounter a handful of common foes that might as well be bosses, including an incredibly deadly vampire that lurks atop Belzimos' palace, and serpentine man-eating plants that populate the hidden passage leading to Rushafel's keep. Both of these enemies soak up a tremendous amount of damage and can approach Firebrand from oblique angles that make them difficult to draw a bead on. Thankfully, these creatures become easier to deal with as Firebrand grows in power. Each new attack skill you gain both increases your attack strength and range, as well as helping you to interact with the environment in different ways. Some enemies are more susceptible to certain attacks than others, so you'll need to swap powers depending on the situation. For example, eventually you start running into the boss of the first stage as a random encounter, and it can't actually be harmed by your claw attack, which is the most powerful ability you possess at the time. Instead, you have to downgrade temporarily to the blockbuster ability in order to be able to advance. And the final dungeon consists almost entirely of spike-lined walls and destructible blocks, meaning you need to alternate constantly between the blockbuster and the claw. Despite the game's brevity, the meager text available on a Game Boy cart, the miserable localization standards of 1990, and the fact that Nintendo's content policies required the game to be censored to the point of nonsensical goofiness, Gargoyle's Quest hinges heavily on a sparse but interesting plot. The entire realm of deadly evil demons who would go on to attempt to conquer Earth under the command of Satan has fallen to an invading army of even eviler demons led by a being named Breger. The demon realm had been conquered once, long before, by Breger's hosts, and the realm ultimately was saved by a mysterious fire from the sky that purged the land of its would-be rulers. The fire in the sky turned out to be metaphorical, a reference to a mutant Arremer who single-handedly repulsed the invaders. Firebrand's journey through his occupied homeland again feels a bit like the hero's journey in the original Dragon Quest, as he retraces the steps of a legendary warrior, collecting the accoutrements of power necessary to become the next metaphorical fire from the sky. For Ghosts N Goblins fans, the game offers plenty of neat references and plot connections, though sadly most of these have been obscured into nonsense in the English version. You can spot the problem right there in the title, Gargoyle's Quest. Nintendo placed a massive prescription on religious content during the 8-bit era, which posed an obvious problem for a game based around a world-conquering, princess-abducting demon who counts Lucifer among his allies. By the time the game's second sequel rolled around on Super NES, Nintendo had lightened up on its censorious mandates, allowing that title to arrive in the US under the more accurate, yet recognizably assonant, title Demon's Crest. Here though, Capcom really had to obfuscate the fact that this was, in fact, the tale of a satanic anti-hero. Besides the title and Firebrand's cover illustration changing his skin tone from red to green while also rendering him with a decidedly goofy expression on his face, Gargoyle's Quest also neutered many of its other series connections in translation. The most obvious of these would be Rushafel, the next-to-last boss of the game. Rushafel, of course, is an English transliteration of the Japanese transliteration of the name Lucifer that managed to bungle every single phoneme when translating it back from Japanese. While understandable, it seems a strange choice given that the series had already localized Lucifer as Loki in Ghouls and Ghosts for Genesis. This somewhat undermines what probably is the best plot event in the game. Firebrand challenges the demon who would go on to be the final boss of Ghouls and Ghosts for demonic supremacy, and wins. This proves what we knew all along, that is, Red Arremers are the most dangerous foes in the Ghosts N Goblins series. Here, Lucifer, or Rushafel if you prefer, has also heard the legend of the fire from the sky, and decided that it referred to him. This actually kind of makes sense given that Lucifer's name means Lightbringer, and in Christian lore he was cast down from the heavens. But when Firebrand arrives at his palace, he challenges the smaller demon to a battle, which the Arremer wins rather handily. Lucifer gives the eternal candle to Firebrand, bringing the hero to full strength and allowing him to go up against Breger to win the game. It's a nice capstone to the story, which reads like a compact yet thoughtful attempt to expand the Ghosts N Goblins series into a bigger universe crammed with lore. Firebrand's journey takes him through the Demon Realm, where he encounters villages full of NPCs recognizable as minor enemies from the earlier games. He also encounters the various demon nobility, who exist in a hierarchy of sorts. First you meet a Baron, Jark, and then the Demon King himself, Darkoan. Lucifer himself is merely a lord serving under Darkoan at this point, which evidently transpires millennia before Ghosts N Goblins. Power within the demon realm, it seems, is conferred not by any demon's inherent nature, but rather through tokens and artifacts. By no means is this the deepest story you'll ever see, even on Game Boy, but it does represent a respectable attempt by Capcom to turn one of its central franchises into something meatier than Demons Take Princess, Man in Underwear Killed Demons Dead. In fact, with the arrival of Gargoyle's Quest, Ghosts N Goblins briefly became Capcom's most complete and fully developed series. Even though the American version whitewashed and obscured Gargoyle's Quest's connections to its predecessors, keen-eyed players knew what was up. So too did keen-eared players. The game's extraordinary soundtrack, the second best on Game Boy to date, has its own distinct personality, but familiar Ghosts N Goblins tunes constantly weave into and out of the mix. Strangely though, despite being perched at the precipice of world-class importance here, Capcom really never followed through on Gargoyle's quest. The series saw only one more mainline entry, Super Ghouls and Ghosts for Super NES, before vanishing for more than a decade. This is easily explained though. Series creator Tokuro Fujiwara left Capcom in 1996, and rather than churn out an endless succession of half-hearted follow-ups, the company simply let the series fade away. Happily, it went down on a good note, as the final chapter of the franchise prior to 2006's Ultimate Ghosts N Goblins was the incredible third chapter in the Gargoyle's Quest saga, Demon's Crest for Super NES. Unless you want to count Maximo, which... We'll tackle Gargoyle's Quest's sequel further down the road, but both Demon's Crest and Gargoyle's Quest 2, which was an NES exclusive in the US and a Famicom and Game Boy Dual release in Japan, did a great job of building on this adventure's strengths while shoring up its weaknesses. They were lengthier, more substantial, less unfair, and looked absolutely stunning in their day. Still, while there's plenty of room for improvement in Gargoyle's Quest, it absolutely deserves to be recognized as one of the Game Boy's best. It's the most ambitious and fully fleshed out action and adventure on the system so far, and it goes a long way toward making up for all the slapdash puzzlers that have been bogging down the system of late. Capcom may have been late for the Game Boy party, but they were fashionably late. Gargoyle's Quest is the kind of rich, thoughtful software few publishers bothered to craft for Nintendo's humble handheld, and the console became a better and more memorable place for the effort. For more rare and precious masterpieces, keep an eye on Game Boy World, and please help support the project. Next time, back to business as usual.